They gave me the transit outpost because nobody else wanted it. That is not a complaint. I have spent enough of my life complaining about fair and unfair to know the difference doesn't interest the universe. The Kethis Medical Transit Outpost on the edge of the Vareth resettlement zone was a half-built thing. 3 pressurized corridors, 8 observation rooms, a common area that smelled of disinfectant and old recycled air, a maintenance contract that paid in food credits, and a sleeping mat in the back utility closet. I am 61 years old. Came off a refugee processing ship 14 months ago with nothing except a toolkit wrapped in a shirt. I know what a fair wage looks like, and I know what survival looks like, and I have learned not to confuse them. My name is Toril Voss. I swept floors for the Kethis outpost for 3.5 months before I understood what the place actually was. I thought it was a medical transit station. Refugees in, stabilize them, process them, refugees out. That is what the intake board said. That is what the corridor signs said. But the far corridor, the one they called Ward 9, was always locked, and the physicians who came and went from it carried the particular silence of people who have stopped expecting results. They did not nod at me. They did not argue with each other in the corridors the way physicians usually do. They simply walked in and walked out, and filed their reports, and went home, and whatever was in Ward 9 did not get better, and did not leave. I found out about her the way I find out about most things. I was mopping under a door. The seal on room 94 leaked. Not badly. A slow seep of temperature-regulated air that fogged the corridor floor on cold mornings and meant the tile never dried properly. I had put in 3 maintenance requests over 6 weeks and received nothing back. So one morning I simply got down on my knees with a tube of sealant compound and a flathead driver and fixed it myself, the way I have fixed everything that needed fixing in my life. And while I was down there, face level with the bottom of the door, I heard her, crying, not speaking. A sound that was quieter than either a long controlled exhalation, the kind a person makes when they are practicing being very still inside a body that does not cooperate. I have made that sound myself. I know what it costs. I finished the seal. I stood up. I went back to my closet and put the sealant away and did not think about it until the next morning when I was mopping that same stretch of corridor, and I heard it again. On the 3rd morning, I left a bowl of grain broth outside the door. I do not know why. I am not a generous man by nature. I am a practical man who has learned that practical things keep you alive and generous things keep you human, and sometimes you have to choose one, and sometimes, if you are careful, you do not. The grain broth was something I made for myself every morning on the single coil heater in my utility closet. Oat grain from the refugee commissary, a cube of mineral stock, a little dried root leaf I had traded 2 hours of labor to get because it smelled like the kitchen where I grew up. It was not medical nutrition. It was not physician-approved dietary protocol. It was just warm. I left it on the floor by the door and kept mopping. When I came back an hour later, the bowl was empty and sitting outside the door, upright, which meant someone had set it there rather than kicked it. Took that as a reasonable sign. The next morning I left 2 bowls. The physicians did not notice for 11 days. When the lead physician, a tall Vethi woman named Soren, who wore her clinical credentials stitched into her collar, finally asked me what I had been leaving outside 94, I told her. Grain broth. She stared at me the way people stare at someone who has done something so simple they cannot figure out why they didn't do it themselves, she said. She has not eaten voluntarily in 6 weeks, I said. The bowl is empty every morning. Physician Soren went very quiet. Then she asked me what was in it, I told her. She wrote it down with the careful attention of someone who suspects a variable they did not control and cannot explain. Then she said I should continue and walked away looking unsettled. I continued. What I did not know, what none of the staff had told me, because I was the floor mopper, and nobody tells the floor mopper anything, was that the woman in room 94 was Lady Thesivar Osi Karath, 3rd daughter of the Karath succession, a noble of the Vethi inner court. She had come to the transit outpost 3 months before my arrival, classified as a patient with a degenerative cellular condition that the inner court's medical staff had been unable to stabilize. The condition changed how her body processed light and temperature. It had taken her voice for weeks at a stretch. It had changed the color of her skin from the warm copper of her family line to something pale and uneven, which the inner court had decided to interpret as shameful. She had been sent here, to the edge of the resettlement zone, while the court decided what to do with a noble whose body was no longer legible as noble. I did not know any of that then. I just knew she ate the broth. On the 14th day, I left the bowl and sat down in the corridor outside the door, not blocking anything, not waiting for anything. I had a length of pressure seal tubing that needed to be rewrapped, and I did that, sitting cross-legged on the floor with my back against the wall, for about 40 minutes. Then I picked up my tools and went back to work. I did this the next day, and the day after. On the 17th day, the door opened. She stood in the frame for a long moment, looking at me. The cellular condition had given her skin a pale, luminous unevenness, patches of silver white at her temples, forearms, and her eyes had the slightly dilated quality of someone who has spent weeks in carefully controlled dim light. She was tall. She was thin in the way that comes from the body consuming itself. She looked at me. The way people look at something they have decided is probably not a threat but are not yet sure of. I looked back. I did not move. I did not say anything reassuring, because I find most reassuring things are lies dressed in a soft voice, and I did not think she would appreciate that. After a while she said, in a voice that had rust in it from disuse, "What are you fixing?" I held up the tubus. "Pressure seal. The corridor runs cold if this goes." She considered that. Then she said, "You have been sitting here." "Yes." "Why?" I thought about it. I said, "Somewhere to sit. The utility closet is smaller." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but it was adjacent to one. She started coming to the doorway every few days. Sometimes she watched me work. Sometimes she didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything, and that was fine. Once I brought an extra cup of grain broth and set it beside mine and drank mine, and she drank hers, and we watched the corridor lights cycle through. Their morning sequence, which is a pale gold, I have always found decent, and that was the whole of it. Court envoys arrived on a morning in the 42nd day of this arrangement, and they were not subtle about it. 4 of them, inner court dress, the kind of attire that makes a pressurized corridor feel suddenly underdressed. They had come to, I learned later, retrieve her or reclassify her, depending on what they found. What they found was Lady Careth standing in the doorway of 90 in her own clothes, upright, color returning to her face, in a way that physician Soren had spent 3 days documenting as medically inexplicable. The lead envoy looked at her and then looked at me. I was mopping, because that is what I do, and then looked at Soren. Soren pointed at me. I do not know what the envoys put in their report. I know that one of them came to me afterward and offered me a formal household position in the Careth inner staff, comfortable quarters, a salary, a title, assistant custodian of the noble residence, which is a very long way of saying the same job I already had. I said I would take the work. I said I didn't need the title. He wrote something down. Then he asked, with what I think was genuine confusion, why I had helped her. I told him what I had told her, because it was still true. The utility closet was smaller. She was already there. It seemed stupid not to. He did not write that down, but he let me keep the broom.